The Australian Financial Review.
The Financial Review's Rich List is Australia's most exclusive club. You need $750 million to make the cut. And this year, we noticed something new. 3/4 of the list are billionaires, compared with just 2 40 years ago, and a rising number have inherited their fortunes. And it's not just happening on the rich list. Many middle-class Australians will eventually receive a windfall from their parents or a wealthy relative, thanks to 40 years of rising superannuation balances and, of course, property prices.
Once upon a time, your parents died and there was maybe a bit of money, but now your parents are going to die and there's a $3 million house and there's a $1.5 million super fund. And whether you've sort of won the lottery of having parents who can pass on a big enough fortune to you is going to increasingly matter.
The rise of Australia's inheritocracy is being felt across the economy, in politics and society, and it's changing how we think about business, money and love.
So if you haven't won the lottery of life and you're not going to receive an inheritance, then single people are paying more attention to their partners and if they're going to be a financial liability or an asset.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Fiona Buffini, in this week for Lisa Murray. Today, Chanticleer columnist James Thomson and wealth reporter Lucy Dean on the surge in inherited wealth, what's behind it, and what can or should be done about it. Hi, James. Hi, Lucy. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us, Fiona.
Thank you for having us.
So every year the Rich List comes out. There's a lot of interest in it. It's one of the most read stories among Financial Review readers. But this year there was a particularly interesting story to be found among the rankings. What's going on?
Well, the nature of the Rich List is changing. So the Rich List is getting older, but it's also getting a lot richer. So the cutoff for the Rich List is now at a record high of $747 million.
Mm-hmm.
And of the 161 billionaires on the Rich List, around 40 inherited a business, had a parent on the list previously, or received a substantial portion of their fortune through an inheritance.
And that means we're seeing a significant slowdown in self-made debutantes. There were only 10 debutantes on last year's list. A couple of decades ago, there were 40.
That's happening at the same time as our rich listers are getting older. In 1984, the average age was 55. Today, it's 70. And what that means is that there's more wealth being held by people who are probably going to pass on in the next few years. So there's going to be this massive wealth transfer.
So think of it like this. Rich List members aged over 80, at the moment, they can collectively control 160 billion. They're getting towards the end of their life. So over the next couple of decades, all of that money is likely to flow to their children, which will further fuel this inheritocracy. So Australia's overall wealth inequality measures are really in the middle of the pack on an international basis, but the issue does become more pronounced when it's seen through an intergenerational lens, and that's where we've got older households holding a disproportionately larger share of wealth than younger households.
And it's leading to a situation where young people are beginning to wonder whether their future success has more to do with their work ethic, their skills, their talents, or if it's more to do with having the right parents.
So the expectation is that this inheritocracy emerging among the top echelons of Australian wealth will only grow larger. And it's a trend happening across all developed countries. But there's always been people who have inherited their wealth. What's unique about now?
Well, I think for starters, rich people are living longer, like all of us. So this allows their fortune to keep building significantly over the course of their lifetime, and it means they've got a hell of a lot more money to pass on to the next generation. But they've also become much better at protecting that wealth. So there's over the last, say, 50 years, there's been the rise of this wealth management industry, which is a dedicated industry that helps rich people stay rich, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it does that by moving their assets into less risky investments. Property is a great example, rather than keeping them in the sole family business. And we've seen that on the Australian Rich List. A lot of people selling their business empire at the top of the market, moving that into property and shares and other less risky assets, and just allowing their fortune to keep gradually expanding at a nice clip. What you don't have is that sort of creative destruction that rich people like to talk about. You know, there's that old saying, the first generation makes it, the second generation builds it, and the third generation loses it.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't happen when you've got this really good wealth management sector making sure nobody loses much money at all.
So the rich list is dominated by inherited wealth. What effect could that have on the economy?
Well, I guess the broad concern is that inherited wealth, particularly when it's managed by those professional investment managers, it might lead to a less dynamic economy, less risk-taking, less innovation, less value creation, compared to a few decades ago when the wealth was being generated by new entrepreneurial ventures rather than being inherited. One of the interesting things about this year's Rich List is that we had one of the Rich List's own members talking about this.
Hi, I'm Alan Schwartz. I'm a businessman, a philanthropist and a social activist.
So Alan Schwartz, he's also a long-time reader of the Rich List.
As a young man, probably my early 20s, I sort of used to go through that list quite enthusiastically, you know, as an aspiring young business person, and looking at it and feeling these people have achieved so much, they've made such a great contribution.
And a member of the Rich List, he ranked 159th this year with a fortune of just over $1 billion.
I hadn't actually looked at the list for probably 25 or 30 years at least, and I was shocked. The total worth of the top 200 in 1984 was $26 billion, and the total worth of the top 200 in 2024 was $625 billion. And I knew that a good proportion of that money sat amongst a large number of baby boomers who are going to be passing it on to their children.
So he acknowledges this. He's in the glass house, but he's also throwing stones. He's worried that inherited wealth is starting to exacerbate the rise of intergenerational wealth inequality.
I think history shows us again and again that increasing inequality creates instability, it creates resentment, and amongst those who inherit the wealth, a sense of entitlement, a sense of belief in their own self-worth, even though they have not really deserved it.
That's when, you know, the haves, basically older Australians, are doing much better at the expense of the have-nots, which are our younger households.
So I think that it undermines productivity, it undermines innovation, it creates social division.
And Schwartz calls this, quote-unquote, a potential cancer on our wonderfully egalitarian ethos and history.
We all know that when people create wealth by creating value for society, that wealth is deserved. That's our system. The problem that I've got is the fact that inherited wealth never had any of those attributes of hard work or value creation.
And his big fear is that the Rich 200 becomes increasingly populated by the beneficiaries of inherited wealth and then served by these wealth managers. Now, that all might be fine, but his concern is that they might use their financial position and their financial resources to put up barriers to competition, to entrench their own positions by looking for, you know, regulatory privileges and tax concessions, and you get very rich people using their financial resources to protect their wealth and create sort of an uncompetitive economy that lacks that dynamism we might have seen in the past.
But I think either out of a sense of self-preservation or out of sense of justice or out of self-interest, it's very possible that enough very wealthy people will say, I've actually got more than I need, and it's not good for me, it's not good for my children, and it's not good for society. So I'm going to give it away, or I'm going to encourage laws that force me to give it away.
Thanks for talking to us, Alan.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Fiona.
Okay, so what Alan was talking about isn't just happening among the top 1%. The rise in inheritance is being mirrored across the population, and Australians will hand down an estimated $5.4 trillion to their benefactors over the next 20 years. James, how did all this wealth accumulate?
Well, it really happened partly because the baby boomer generation has been extraordinarily lucky.
7 out of 10 families in Australia own or are buying homes of their own. Most prefer
They've had, over the last 40 years or so, this perfect storm of globalisation.
Fine buildings, well sited in wide streets, give Melbourne her character of solidity and easy dignity.
Low interest rates, low inflation.
The cost of building a house depends on its size and, to some extent, location.
which has all helped to make asset prices almost continuously rise. And this has allowed them to accumulate almost unprecedented levels of wealth.
If we're looking at a minimum $35,000 house, and the maximum on your salary is $21,000 that we could loan you, I think you still have a deposit to get together of about $14,000. Okay.
Household wealth in Australia is really at a historic high at the moment. So if you're on the right side of that, if you've bought a house in the 70s, 80s, or even the 90s and held on to it, that's all you needed to do to accumulate a large amount of money. And then if you've bought shares during that period, and through super at least most people have, then you've also had this great tailwind to your wealth creation. Super's really important to this. Not only does Australia's superannuation system force us to save, so we've automatically enjoyed a lot of the benefits of rising markets and that sort of thing over the last 40 years, but it's also loaded with really generous tax breaks, which keeps incentivising people to save more and build their wealth even further. And of course, you can't have this conversation without property. It's the dominant asset in household wealth and counts for a much greater proportion of household wealth in Australia compared to places like Canada and the US and Britain and New Zealand. So property wealth is really important on its own, but it's also what property allows you to do. If you want to start a new business, you can't do it really without getting a loan that's secured by some form of property. But all of a sudden we're in this situation where to get onto the property ladder, you now need a much higher level of income than in the past. So the property and loans are going to older, wealthier households rather than the younger, newer households that might be more likely to create businesses. So you've got this situation where getting into the property market, being able to start a business, it's starting to get down to a bit of a lottery as to whether your parents are wealthy through property and super themselves and how much will they have to pass on to you.
So there's new data from CoreLogic that found that it would take 10.6 years for the average first home buyer to save up a 20% deposit. That's assuming that they're saving about 15% of their income. But that's a huge challenge if you're battling successive rent hikes.
Well, you can chase that dream all your life, but it just keeps slipping away. But when you start to plan...
So if you haven't won the lottery of life and you're not going to receive an inheritance, then single people are paying more attention to their partners and if they're going to be a financial liability or an asset.
So we've been talking about how inherited wealth isn't just for the very rich and how it's changing Australia, not just in business, but also in our relationships. So Lucy, what have you found in your reporting?
While I've been writing about property, I've also been writing about dating and love. And the experts that I've spoken to, these are people who are, high-end matchmakers. They're dating app people. They are researchers who interviewed hundreds of people about their experiences dating. They found that in the last few years, people are far more likely to be paying attention to each other's financial habits on dates. It's not that people are being completely unromantic or saying, I only want to date a man in finance. Basically, they just want to make sure that their partner isn't spending all of their money on sports bet and cocaine. There was a Bumble survey that came out last year that found that 34% of Australian singles think it's fine to ask about a potential partner's financial status early on in a relationship. And what's happening is that it's also prompting some pretty weird behaviour on dates. I spoke to someone who knew a guy who had a couple of dating rules. The first one was that if a woman arrived on the date with a designer handbag, that was a cross against her name. And if she pulled out a wallet from the same designer, that was 2 crosses against her name, because he thought that meant that she was overly materialistic and, frivolous, which was, obviously a shocking assumption. The woman was getting her wallet out of the bag,
to pay,
probably to
presumably.
pay. So I thought it was just a weird story, but it shows where people are at. And it's playing out across, the shows and the stories that we are paying attention to at the moment, like White Lotus, Succession. Before that, there was Crazy Rich Asians. Right now, there's the materialists, and they're all asking these questions about how important is money when it comes to forging relationships. This isn't a new thing. You know, we can go back to the 18th century and we had Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, where the surest way to get rich was not by working hard. To be fair, women in that era, they probably couldn't earn a living, but by marrying the right person. It just feels sad to me. You know, it's so unromantic to reduce the person that you're going to spend the rest of your life with to their income or their assets. Luckily for Lizzie in Pride and Prejudice, you know, Darcy was fabulously wealthy, but her best mate Charlotte ends up married to Mr. Collins. He's a loser, but he's very rich.
I'm 27 years old. I've no money and no prospects.
And there's a key moment from the 2005 Pride and Prejudice adaptation that it's been circling the internet for years, and it keeps playing up across my Instagram.
I'm already a burden to my parents, and I'm frightened.
And it's this moment when Lizzie's close friend Charlotte explains why she decided to marry Mr. Collins, who Lizzie had rejected because she didn't love him.
So don't judge me, Lizzie. Don't you dare judge me.
It keeps being shared by millennial people who say, I relate to this. I'm scared. I don't know how I'm going to do this alone.
Yep.
So perhaps you can understand why for so many people, their partner's financial habits and behaviours and their ability to be good with their finances is a serious consideration.
What are the consequences of this rise in wealth and its unequal spread? Where could it lead? What are the worst case scenarios?
If you've got more than 10 years to save for a house, and if you can't tap parental wealth, you might be getting towards 40 before you're in a position to buy. That's an extremely long time. And even my kids, you know, the 13-year-old, he jokes a little bit about, I need to save a little bit more money to buy a house. And his mother and I sort of look at him and go, you have no idea what you're going to need to buy a house. But then you sort of start thinking, are those kids going to be at my house forever? Is that what I have to look forward to? So it's a vexed issue. I don't think there'd be many parents or grandparents who aren't thinking about how this might work out for their kids and their grandkids. Mm-hmm. You can extend it from there, though. Think about the consequences for business. You wouldn't want to be starting a business that's aimed at young people who are paying 30 to 40% of their wage in housing costs, whether that's a mortgage or rents, because they're just not going to be able to drive your business growth along. And then think about the consequences for politics. If you think that, as Matt Comyn, the CEO of Commonwealth Bank, says, that there's this sort of unspoken compact between older generations that they will leave the world a better place for the next generation, then you can see how younger voters will start to get pretty upset with the world that they're being left. Clearly, housing is a big issue, but you've also got climate change and even AI starting to come through and affect the workforce of the future. So it's quite possible that we could see politics start to become a lot more polarised as younger voters become a bigger block or part of the electorate. You can already see this, I guess, in a way, in what we saw in New York recently, where we had a 33-year-old Democratic primary winner who is promising to freeze rent and promising free transport to help the people of that city deal with their cost of living crisis. So Could we see the emergence of those sort of leaders in Australia and who want to tax wealth a lot harder and provide more support for younger generations? I think it's entirely possible.
The thing about New York is that it's also heinously expensive, and Sydney is the same. We know that young people are leaving cities like New York, like Sydney, like London. It's a story playing out across the globe. And these aren't, it's a whole range of people. It's people on average incomes. It's people on high incomes. It's essential workers who now have to live quite far away from the city, which has all sorts of secondary impacts. It impacts our health. It impacts our ability to make friends. It's when our cities die, we lose so much vitality. It also means that our cities become increasingly gentrified. They are home only to an increasingly wealthy and older cohort of people. Mm-hmm. We know that if you are a person of a low socioeconomic status, you're more likely to increase your income if you live in an area with a high degree of variation in incomes. But if you live in an area where you are surrounded by people on similar incomes, then you're more likely to stay where you are. That has immediate implications, which means that when our young people and our poorer people leave our cities, that has huge implications for the ability of those people to actually move through the income ranks and build wealth.
The intergenerational consequences of this inheritocracy are really complex and really difficult to wrap your head around and difficult to do much about, but I think it's something that politicians are going to have to start thinking about because it's becoming a much bigger problem.
Okay, so what are our politicians doing or thinking about doing?
Not much is probably the first answer. I guess we've started to see the first steps towards talking about tax reform that might deal with these problems. But look, they've been pretty controversial. What Jim Chalmers thought was a pretty minor change to self-managed superannuation taxation. That's the taxation of unrealised gains for accounts with $3 million or more, has blown up into sort of a real political storm. So when Chalmers starts to think about more broader tax reform, maybe in terms of the generous tax breaks offered in super, you can just tell how big a fight that would be. I guess the other idea that Australia could consider, again, it would be hugely controversial, is an inheritance tax. We used to have inheritance taxes, but they were dispatched in the 1970s and really stamped with never come back. But we're a bit of an international outlier. Lots of other places in the world do have inheritance taxes of some form, and it might be something that we need to think about, particularly as the labour pool shrinks. We've got an ageing population. The pool of workers paying income tax is naturally going to shrink, and so you could see the balance of taxation shift from taxing labour, as we do at the moment, more towards taxing wealth. And an inheritance tax would be part of that discussion. But again, we've seen how people have gone absolutely crazy over this small proposal on unrealised tax gains. You can just imagine the furore that you'd see around inheritance taxes.
Okay, so this has been a very depressing conversation. Is there anything you guys are optimistic about? Can we take any solace from the fact that people are now starting to talk about this issue?
I think I might be slightly more optimistic than JT. Maybe it's because I don't have kids. I suspect that you're probably a bit more worried about the future if you've got children. But I do think that politicians and wealthy people are speaking more about this. I spoke to Paul Bassett last year. He's the co-founder of Seek, and he thinks that we are on the cusp of change. That, the rubber really hits the road when you realise that your children are going to have to live 3 hours away from you and you're never going to see your grandkids. And I think that we are starting to see some progress there in terms of people actually realising that, this gravy train they've been on in terms of wealth accumulation, it has costs. It has costs to their happiness. On the other hand, the debate around the $3 million super tax does make me think that self-interest is still very much at play in these discussions.
I think the big cause for optimism is that we're in a really good position to have this conversation. I mean, household wealth is sitting around $17 trillion or about $616,000 per person. You'd much rather be having this conversation from a position of sort of relative wealth strength than relative wealth weakness. So that's a bit of optimism, I guess. The other bits of optimism, as Lucy said, is that we're starting to see a national conversation about this. The whole point of tax reform is, and it looks like a holistic conversation on tax reform, is going to have to get to some of these issues if it's going to be a real serious conversation, which it seems like that's what the government wants to have. And I think the other thing is that these issues are really now with us. As I said before, every parent and every grandparent is thinking about what's the world going to look like for their kids and grandkids. What does it mean that they can't afford housing? What are they going to have to do to make sure they can help their kids and grandkids into housing? Now, that goes to the heart of the inheritocracy, doesn't it? Are we just going to sort of perpetuate this cycle where the kids who have won the lottery of life and have got parents with assets, they're the winners? Or are we going to try and figure out a way to break that down a bit and open up the economy to make sure that sort of Australian spirit of egalitarianism that Alan Schwartz refers to stays alive? So it's not an easy thing to deal with, But I think the fact that we're starting to deal with it is something that we can be a bit optimistic about.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Lucy.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Fiona. Great to be here.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Fiona Bavini, filling in for Lisa Murray with Chanticleer columnist James Thomson and Wealth reporter Lucy Dean. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow with assistance from Mandy Coulin, and our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. Lisa will be back next week.
The Australian Financial Review.